I will introduce you to Renza Nauda, our Program Director for Work and Economics, who will be our moderator for the evening.
Okay, thank you, Monica. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to Cardus for those of you who may not be familiar with us. We are a public policy think tank, much like many other. Sorry, thank you. Much like many of the other policy think tanks around the country. But one of the things that makes us distinct is that we do our public policy from a Christian worldview. That can mean many different things, but I think one of the most fundamental things it means is that we look at public policy through what I would call a Christian anthropology. So we understand human beings as made in the image of God, and that's the fundamental, I think, principle that we start with. It also means that we do a lot of work that deals with the intersection of faith and public policy. We actually are standing on an intersection of two streets, one with the cathedral at one end and one with Parliament and the executive branch of government at the other. So we're literally standing at the intersection of faith and public policy. So it's a very suitable place for us to start our conversation this evening. So the title of this event is How Much Faith Can We Place in Public Policy? And just to frame the conversation a little bit, I think there are two senses in which we mean this question. The first, you could reformulate that question as, what is the role of religious faith in public policy? And that's probably going to be the first part of our discussion. And so I'll ask our panel members about their experiences in public policy roles and how their faith has influenced their careers and how they think about some of these issues. But there's a second sense in which we can understand that question, and you could reformulate the question as, how much faith or how much trust can we place in public policy and those who make it? And so I want to touch on that a little bit, especially in the second half of the conversation. I think that this, just to give you a little bit of an idea of how the evening will progress, I think we'll probably spend about 45 minutes with me just having some question and answer with our panelists. And then I'd like to leave a decent amount of time for questions from you. So if there are questions that are coming up as you're thinking about these issues and some of the things that the panelists might be saying, please keep them in your head and save them for the end, because I do want to save 20 or 30 minutes for that. So as I said, Cardus is a Christian think tank. And so we will deal this evening with some very explicitly Christian themes. That said, we also understand that faith can take many different forms. I've already talked about two senses in which that may be the case, but we also at Cardus want to make sure that we always have a very welcoming atmosphere. And so we want to ensure that we understand faith in as broadly a sense as possible as well. So although many of you may be Christian yourselves, some of you maybe not. Everyone is absolutely welcome here, and we hope that through this conversation you'll pick something up that you'll find interesting and useful. So without further ado, I think I'm going to ask. I'm sorry. I should introduce our panelists. So at the other end is Steve Kuhn. He is Canada's Chief Negotiator for Climate Change and Director General of Multilateral Affairs and Climate Change. He's worked for over 20 years in the federal and Ontario governments in the public service. And most recently has been with environmental climate change since May of 2020. He will be moving in 10 days, I think you said, to the Department of Finance as Associate ADM for the international section. We have Rachel Curran. She is the head of public policy for Meta Canada. You may have seen her name in the news a little bit lately. Prior to that, she was with Harper and Associates. She's also, before that, she was the Director of Policy in Mr. Harper's PMO, and as well as an instructor at the Carleton University's Riddell Program in Political Management. And Andrea Senya is the Director of Policy for Cardus. She joined Cardus originally as a Next Gen Fellow a few years ago, and is now our Director of Policy. She has previously worked also on the political staff, but at the provincial level in the Alberta Legislature during the time of Premier Kenney. And outside of work, she can be found having deep chats with friends. Okay, all right. So, all right. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. I'll start with Stephen or Steve. Could you please describe how your faith has impacted your work in public policy? I'd love to hear you discuss some about your decision to enter the public service and how you see your current role in terms of your faith, and maybe a little bit about how that might have shifted over time.
Good evening, everyone. Maybe I'll just start almost some of the themes of your introduction. So I've been in public service for 22 years in the Ontario government and the federal government. And I was answering the question, splitting my time between those two levels of government. Like many people, 22 years ago, I stumbled into government, into the public service, getting a job as a summer job from university, continuing in through university as a public servant. And I really enjoyed that job, but there was after a time, after 5 years or so, there was no real spark to it. Like it didn't feel like the right place or the right fit for me. And so I actually took a year off, and I moved to Mozambique. And part of that year was exploring for me this exact question of how my faith and my career ought to intersect. I guess as an early 20s person, I was thinking about that question a lot. And I thought at the time that what I was being called to, it's sort of interesting in this conversation, well, I'll switch between church language and work language, and I almost called you a congregation, just as kind of an example of that, but I'll stop doing that. I felt at the time, and being in Mozambique was an exploration of what I was called to do, what I was meant to do with my career. And I thought about working in NGOs at the time. I was there as a missionary with a small organization. Like, is that the right fit for me? And through that time, what became very clear to me is that I actually really like being in government. I like working in public policy. That feels like the right fit for me. I like working within Canada. But I also like this space that engages for me. The passion issue is global poverty. So you spoke in your introduction about the centrality of people and us being the image bearers of Christ. Like, to me, that notion, if I use that church language, I see people around the world through that lens. In the work world, I might talk about sort of there might be a bit of a diversity and inclusion conversation there, or there might be an equality conversation about people around the world that I feel called to engage with. And so when I came back from Mozambique, I moved to Ottawa and restarted a career in the federal public service doing this work. And maybe just quickly on the second question of how that faith has shifted over time, and so now I've been here for 15 years in Ottawa. As a younger person starting into Ottawa, I felt this clear sense that I was supposed to be here. This was the right place to be, but I didn't have a clear sense of why. I didn't know what I was supposed to be doing within that career environment. And so most often, my faith was lived out outside of work at that period of time. We have a Matthew House Ottawa board member sitting at the back. 13 years ago, I was engaged in starting a refugee shelter in the city that now has grown to serving 80 people at a time, 149 houses furnished this past month alone. That was kind of how I lived out my faith in parallel to my work. But as I gained confidence in the job that I do in the government, became, quite frankly, a little bit of an insider in the public service, felt like this is my place and I belong. Then over time, I became more comfortable expressing my faith. And that's not an explicit way. That's not something I do with words, but it certainly is something that I do with how I engage in my career. And we can talk more detail about that as we go on.
Thank you very much, Steve. Rachel.
Well, now that's a tough act to follow. Thanks, Steve. So I'm pretty impressed and amazed by, I guess, intentionality that I hear from Steve. I know you say you never sort of expressed your faith at work and really lived it outside of work in many ways. Nevertheless, there still seems to be more of a plan there, at least an intentional plan on your part, than certainly there was for me. I never planned to get into public policy. There was certainly never any decision to get into public policy. I started off studying English literature in university because I just liked reading a lot. I eventually went to law school because I was in the master's program for English literature and realized I didn't want to be an academic. And so law school seemed like an easy route out of that. There was certainly no plan to become a lawyer. And then I started practicing law. And I was invited to get involved in a political campaign in British Columbia, which is where I was practicing law. And as a consequence of my involvement in that political campaign, I was invited to come work at the legislature in Victoria and work for the provincial government in BC, and ended up loving public policy in that context, and really kind of falling in love with the intersection of policy and politics, which I think is what public policy is in kind of its purest sense. But again, none of that involved any kind of decision-making or deliberate planning on my part. During that time in British Columbia, I was in an office right next to a guy who had run Belinda Stronach's leadership campaign for what was then, what was the predecessor to the Conservative Party of Canada. He was in British Columbia to kind of cleanse himself from any association with Belinda Stronach, because of course Stephen Harper had won that campaign. And when Mr. Harper formed government, he went back to Ottawa and invited me to come work for one of the ministers in the Harper government. And so I did that, went to work for Monty Solberg, who was then Minister of Immigration and Human Resources, and then ended up in Mr. Harper's Prime Minister's office, and eventually took over as Director of Policy there. But truly, there was no, I love kind of mentoring younger people and talking to them about how to develop their careers. And one question I always get is like, how can I follow the same path? And I have no idea. Like there was no planning, there was no decision making. Truly, these were doors. Look, I'm a Christian. I have not talked about that publicly very much at all. These were doors that were opened by God. And I walked through those doors sometimes reluctantly, and kind of ended up where I am now. So we could talk more about kind of the intersection of faith and public policy and the day-to-day practice of public policy. But I would say, as far as my career progression goes, I have tried very deliberately to keep faith separate from my day-to-day work in government or in policy spheres, with some success. And I do think there is a role for faith in public policy, but I think we have to be very careful how we apply faith to our work in government or in think tanks or in public policy spheres. So we'll get into more detail later. I'm sorry, my story of my career progression is not more inspiring, but really it was almost, at least from my perspective, accidental the entire way.
Don't sell yourself short. I think that sounds fascinating, and I think you were seeing the hand of God in this. I think is very inspiring. So thank you very much, Rachel. Andrea, I wonder if you could share a little bit about this.
Yes. I have a far less interesting and illustrious career than the two people I'm sharing the stage with, so this will be a shorter segment, I think. But I didn't grow up in Canada, and so I always had an intuitive sense that good governance and poor governance can have a real impact on the day-to-day lives of people. And so I think that was my sort of initial interest. If I was kind of gunning for a halo with this answer, I would say that I was deeply motivated by Christian social thought to begin my work in politics. That was not the case. I think I was just very curious, and I was also very ambitious. And so that's kind of how, through a series of happy accidents or providence, I ended up in the Alberta legislature during the COVID years, which was an interesting time if you follow Alberta politics. But I think that I came to the limits of my ambition very quickly, and I realized it was a bit more of a hamster wheel than I had initially anticipated. And my transition from politics to Cardus, I think, was more motivated by a deeper desire to see more of an integral view of the human person being implemented in the kinds of policies that we were pursuing at the time. And I had a bit of a sense that the things that I was professing to believe on Sunday were different from the things that I was doing Monday to Friday. And I think that really caused a lot of tension for me internally. And that's not always the case, or it doesn't have to be the case if you're working in politics or in various public policy fields. Contrary to Rachel, I did not fall in love with the politics and policy. I think I was more interested in the policy than the politics. And so that's kind of how I ended up here.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Andrea. One of the interesting things about this panel is that they're all doing public policy, but in fairly different environments. So I just want to point something out. We have public service, we have the political staff, but also the private sector, in the political staff on the federal government side. And then, Andrea, you have experience at the provincial level, but also in something different than the other two panelists, an explicitly Christian environment doing public policy. So I want to get a little bit into what it means to do this kind of work on a day-to-day basis with faith kind of there somehow. So Rachel, maybe I'll start with you. In your first answer, you talked a little bit about you hinted at this, I think, and particularly around agenda setting for government, because that's what you were doing as director of policy to Prime Minister Harper. Can you give us a little bit more about where you're going with that in terms of that?
Yeah, okay. So this might be a little bit controversial for this audience, and I don't know how comfortable I am walking out on this limb, but I think certainly as a Christian, this has been my perspective, and I know a lot of Christians disagree with this. I think being a person of faith should inform your perspective, certainly, your work ethic, for sure, the way you work, for sure, your character, for sure. I don't think it should inform your policy agenda, especially if you're working, in the kind of upper echelons of a country like Canada. We live in a democracy, not a theocracy. And so, Christians have very strong views on certain policy issues. And I agree with a lot of those as a Christian myself. I don't believe it's my role, because I have the privilege of serving in the Prime Minister's office, to impose those views on the rest of the population. So, our work should be to change hearts and minds on issues we feel strongly about. I think our work cannot be to legislate certain outcomes or certain issues to a population that is reluctant at best and kind of hostile at worst. So I have had some tense, I would say, conversations with other Christians who serve in government on these issues, and they feel very strongly about certain policy matters. But I don't think it's ever appropriate to try and impose a certain worldview or a certain agenda or certain policy outcomes on an unwilling population. That's not the role of Christians serving in government, in my view. But I'm happy to discuss that further.
And we'll have a Q&A section after this, so that'll be excellent. But Stephen, do you want to react to that, or can you tell us a little bit about faith in the public service on a day-to-day basis?
It's a great question, and it is a challenging question for the reasons that Rachel clearly articulated. For me, I think we'll get into the conversation about specific areas where my faith has engaged particular public policy questions, and I think that's where some of these issues will come out in a clear way. But I think the starting point for the answer for me is, I mean, my starting point is a little bit different than Rachel's. Sitting within the public sector, the sort of public service, where my job is not to make decisions. My job is not to make public policy. My job is to support a government that has been elected on an agenda to implement public policy. So my starting point is different, even though my ending point might actually be in roughly the same place. And so for when I think about the day-to-day and how my faith engages with the day-to-day, I actually probably reinforce some of those things that Rachel said. When I think about the day-to-day, I think about what faith means for me as a public servant engaging with employees or engaging with various stakeholder groups or other areas of engagement. For me, I said in my previous answer, and maybe it sounded a little bit too Sunday school, but I do have a sense that I'm in the right place. I do have kind of a piece that this is the right place for me at this time, and that can change, but that's a comfortable place to be. And because of that piece that I feel about my career, I think that frees me from other thoughts that often hold people back in their careers, or that are poisonous to workplace cultures. And I think, for example, about the fact that even though I've had an interesting career so far, I think I've done some interesting things, but I don't define myself by that, or at least I try really hard not to define myself by what I do and by those fancy job titles that I have. I want to be able to walk away from that if that's what were next on my list of things to do, and that wouldn't fundamentally affect my vision of myself or my family's vision of myself. And similarly, I'm because of that comfort I feel, I'm not trying to climb a ladder. I'm not motivated by that. I'm not trying to impress people. I'm not trying to compete with people. And that, I think in some ways that's unusual. I think in some ways that is, those are not typical cultures within at least the workplaces that I've been in, but gives me some degree of comfort, gives me some freedom from day-to-day stresses and engagement with people in my workplace. And I think people see that. And I think people seeing how I engage is one of the most fundamental ways that I can express my faith to people. But one other specific answer on the day-to-day also is that, and focusing again on the workplace rather than public policy directly on a day-to-day basis, is that, and I guess focusing on this notion that you introduced at the beginning of people being made in the image of God, like in the public service, we have a code of values and ethics, and that there's no faith basis to that at all. But when I look at that, there are many elements of it that I would say are consistent with what I bring to my own sort of personal code of conduct based on my faith. And one of those is people values, like thinking about human dignity, thinking about the value of every person, kind of familiar words to the Christian-centered introduction to the talk. And if I put public policy aside for a moment, on a day-to-day basis, I'm responsible for 100 people. There are 100 people that work for me, and 100 people who come to work, sometimes with somebody on my team has cancer right now. Somebody is going through a divorce. Somebody has lost a child, and these are real people facing real issues. And we all spend far too much of our time, in our workplace. And for a lot of those 100 people, that workplace is their primary community for a lot of them. And so the ability that I have, the influence or the power that I have over the well-being of those people in small ways and sometimes in big ways, I feel like is an important element of living out my faith. Again, not exactly in a public policy way, but for sure in a workplace that is the public service that engages these questions of public policy.
Yeah, very interesting. Actually, as you're saying that, a lot of this is ringing true for a lot of. I'm just going to do a quick plug for my program. We at the Work in Economics program do a lot of work around the workplace as a community and what that means and how we can try to make that more so. I see a lot of the work we do in what you're talking about. But Andrea, maybe I was wondering if you might respond a little bit to what Rachel was saying, but in a particular way, which is, you work now at a more explicitly Christian organization, but you came from a more secular environment in the provincial government. And I'm curious to know what the distinctions there might be, or how what you've seen different, and in response maybe to a little bit of what Rachel was saying, just to give a different flavor to that.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, picking up on what Steve had to say, when I was working in a more secular environment, I think I went into politics expecting to advance the kinds of issues that I suspect Rachel is alluding to. I think those were the sort of policy issues that were front of mind for me. And what I found on the day-to-day was that my faith was implicated more so in my conduct, which will be of no surprise to anyone who is trying to practice their faith. But yeah, just in the way that I was conveying my own positions and even just pursuing excellence in that sense. I think the work of Cardus, from the explicitly Christian lens, makes life easier a little bit and also more difficult. Easier in the sense of within the organization, we understand that we agree on certain first principles, and it's pretty easy to kind of get to work after that, figuring out the rest of the details. And then to try to share those policies in a more sort of secular world. What I'd say maybe in response to some of what Rachel said is that I think Christians have a tendency to view a very niche set of issues as being sort of the key public policy issues. And it's not that I think that they're necessarily wrong about that, but our view at Cardus is that the truths that we believe and the truths that we hold as Christians are fundamental truths about human beings and the human person and the best ways to order society. And so it's not to say that it's easy to both faith and reason have a role to play, which is why we start with our first principles at Cardus and then invest a lot of time in high quality research and good data and policy prescriptions that are respecting the confines that different public servants or political staff may be operating under. But a lot of what our view of being created in the image and likeness of God means is that that's true for everyone. And living out those truths and litigating kind of the details of that is where the hard work is. But yeah, I think for us sometimes as Cardus going out into the world, it can be hard to convince people that we're not trying to proselytize or offer baptisms after 5 p.m. Which we might do if you asked. But that's really not the main thrust of our work. The main thrust of our work is that this is what we believe is true about the human person and about how to rightly order society. And we're doing our best to figure out what those details are. You may disagree, and we're not suggesting that our position is the Christian position or the correct position. And it kind of depends on the issue we're talking about. But yeah, I would say that we're advancing something that we believe is more fundamental about human anthropology in general, about the best way for individuals to flourish and for society to flourish. And so I don't know if I really got to the heart of your...
No, I think you did. I also wanted to talk a little bit about challenges being a person of faith in government or in politics. First of all, I'm curious if you think it's necessary to have faith in something to be successful in these kinds of positions, or conversely, do you think it can be a hindrance? I imagine people would say that in order for a politician to be successful, he or she must contort him or herself in many different ways that are not true to their fundamental commitments. Is that true? Is it necessarily true? Take it from there. Maybe I'll go ahead. The neutral public servant. Start there.
Exactly. So this is a question that I think about often, to be honest, and sometimes, well, thankfully, just as a framing comment, I'm hard pressed to think about the past 22 years on public policy issues that I work on where I have been forced to be contorted. And that's partly a function of being in the public service as opposed to a decision-making or a more direct role supporting decision makers. Partly a function perhaps of the fact that as a public servant, I work in sort of narrower bands of public policy issues than the director of policy for the prime minister might, for example. But I think there's more to it than that. And I'm gonna maybe tonight use one piece of scripture and it's just kind of a useful one for me thinking about this question, and it's Micah 6:8. The notion of asking what the Lord requires of me, and it's to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. And I focus particularly on walking humbly with God, that notion of humility, that notion from my perspective that flexibility is not a bad thing. Sometimes as Christians, we think flexibility means wavering from my deep held principles. But for me, flexibility means having the humility to recognize that while I may have perspectives on work or my faith, I don't have a monopoly on those perspectives. And that every one of us have different perspectives. Every one of us support different political parties, have probably different expressions of even our own Christian faith. If we had this conversation just about the faith that we hold, we would probably have different perspectives across the room, and that is okay. And talking about those differences does not mean that I'm right and somebody else is wrong. It means that we have different perspectives and worldviews and experiences, and through our lens, through our eyes of that experience, we can work together to sharpen our understanding of our faith or of public policy issues. So that humility is an important aspect for me, both from a public policy perspective, but also from a church community perspective. And I really wanted to be as concrete as possible with this question. I wanted to think about maybe a time in my career when my faith was challenged the most, and I think actually it was Rachel and I had this sort of a year of our time where our worlds almost intersected when she was in the Prime Minister's office and I was in the Privy Council office working on foreign and defense policy issues, and just as as a background on my faith experience, I have kind of an eclectic faith background, but part of it is influenced by Anabaptism. My grandparents are Mennonite. I currently attend an Anabaptist church. One of the things that really was kind of striking to me growing up is that I grew up at a time when all of my friends had grandparents who had war stories and photos and artifacts, and that was who their grandparents were. And I didn't have any of that. I grew up in this Mennonite tradition where, my grandparents were, maybe they were conscientious objectors. For whatever reason, we didn't even talk about that. They were not engaged in World War II. And I'm sitting in 2013 in the Privy Council office. I'm, a nice economist from the Department of Finance who's gone there to deal with European economic issues. Greece and 2013, things like that were the order of the day. Until the fall of 2013, when Euromaidan happened in Ukraine. And then in early 2014, there was a revolution in Ukraine. And then Russia annexed Crimea in March. And suddenly, as the Europe analyst, giving advice to the Prime Minister in the Prime Minister's office, my grandparents, I couldn't even talk to them about my job because we were, engaged in, pretty in proximate ways to questions of, NATO engagement, NATO support, and, soldiers killing soldiers, soldiers killing not soldiers. And that was like, for me, I could generally work on public policy issues that were comfortable for me. And in this context, the unthinkable was happening. War was happening in Europe, and I was thrust into working on something that was kind of uncomfortable for me, that I needed to work through. And let's be honest about Christianity as well. Like I mean, first of all, I worked very closely for the first time with people in the Department of National Defense, with people in the Canadian Armed Forces, with political staff, some of all these people have Christian perspectives to bring to bear on these issues as well. And maybe the most uncomfortable truth in the conversation is that Russia holds itself up as being a Christian nation. Like Russian Orthodox Christianity is prominent in Russia. So they're engaged in this conversation about war in Europe in some ways through the same lens that we as Christians are engaged in conversation about that conflict. And that was difficult. That was really difficult for me to understand what that meant, what my public service career meant from that perspective, whether or not I was in the right place, what that meant for my faith. I learned a lot about the Canadian military. I learned a lot about my own faith through that experience. But I think that, like, for me, leaning on that notion of humility, leaning on that notion of Christians engaging with Christians and Christians engaging with non-Christians on important public policy matters helped me to reflect on the role of the government, helped me to reflect on really what I believe at my core. And maybe to Rachel's point in her previous answer, I don't think that my Anabaptist background ever bled into policy advice going to the Prime Minister in notes about how Canada should engage on foreign policy questions pertaining to Russia. But it certainly made me a better person as a Christian to be wrestling with those issues alongside people that I know were wrestling from different perspectives and different experiences alongside me. And maybe just the final thing that I would say, and I kind of alluded to this already, is that the public sector is a big place. The public service is a big place. We could talk about, and maybe we can test some of these notions in the Q&A about where the limits of our comfort is and where we're comfortable working on public policy issues that challenge my faith and that sharpen my faith versus public policy areas where I would need to step out and conscientiously object. I've never seen a place like that so far in my career, but I do think about what that might look like. The public service is also a big enough place that, generally speaking, people can pick and choose the policy issues that matter to them and work on those issues. And within bounds of a normally functioning government in Canada, can work on issues that are most comfortable and consistent with their backgrounds and experiences and avoid others.
Director of Policy doesn't have an opportunity to pick and choose what issues come to her desk.
No,
Different
but I'm really glad that people like Steve are in the public service. They're so thoughtful and really so careful about the advice they provide and really dig into the details in a way that's incredibly useful for political hacks like me. But let me just talk about the political perspective because it's so different from yours, Steve. Look, I think the bigger problem for people of faith in Canada just generally is indifference, not hostility, like open hostility. I've been super privileged to work for people of faith, men of faith throughout my entire career. That includes the former Prime Minister, who, although he never said so explicitly, was just drew his strength and his kind of sense of who he was from his faith. And so that's been just such a great example for me. But look, from a political perspective, is it problematic to be associated with faith or with Christianity? Yeah, I mean, you get pigeonholed, I think, as one of the, and this is, I think, maybe why I didn't talk about my faith more in my political career. You get sort of pigeonholed as one of the dreaded so-cons, right? The social conservatives, you know, they're sort of one mind. They're going to make life difficult for you unless you kind of pursue certain policy objectives. You know, they're a group to be managed. They're likely to pop up in the middle of a campaign in a really problematic way and maybe cost you a few seats. Definitely, it'll cost you seats in Quebec. So I think just from a political perspective, if you're a person of faith, there is some suspicion attached to that in terms of the impact on a party's political fortunes. So that's certainly something to keep in mind, or at least it was an issue for me during my time in government. But really, I think the more, I think that, and we're very fortunate to be in this position in Canada where we have generally religious freedom. People may not like your views, but you certainly have the freedom to express them. And to have them taken seriously in many respects when kind of having public policy discussions. I do think the bigger problem here is indifference rather than active hostility, and we can talk about that.
Yeah, I think that and this is definitely informed by my own personal experience, but it's hard for people to roast you for what you believe if you're good at your job. And so I think that's always competence is a good place to start. And I think sometimes Christians can feel, oh shucks, about ourselves that, you know, that we're being dismissed for X, Y, Z reason. And if that is really happening and is explicitly the case, then it's not to say that it doesn't happen, but I think that you can mitigate a lot of that by showing that you're competent at your job generally. And I think that approach informs a lot of the way that Cardus works to present our research or our materials when we're engaging, whether it's at a House of Commons committee, which we've presented at twice this year now. So if the narrative is that, like you're saying, it's not open hostility to Christians all the time anyway, not terribly so. I think really what the combination of answers that you both have given is showing, and it's kind of the heart of why we were trying to have this conversation, which is that policy analysis is not purely an exercise in technocratic and technical reasoning, that our faith and reason work together to bring us to certain conclusions. And that's why, you know, Stephen's example of him wrestling with his own values, or Rachel, your example of whether or not it's appropriate for a politician to impose a specific worldview through legislation, you know, onto the populace is part of the questioning and the rational discernment that we have to go through of starting with our first principles, but realizing that the encyclicals don't give me an answer to how to structure a Bill C-22 Canada disability benefit, at least not explicitly, unless it's in invisible ink and I didn't see it. And so those are great starting points, but there is continued work to do in terms of bringing, like I said, sort of rational reasoning into what kinds of policies that we formulate and then how we present them. So I think going back to your original question, is it a challenge in the day-to-day to be a Christian? Yeah, maybe in some respects, but I do think that it's not necessarily a hindrance. And to Rachel's point, I don't think it's an automatic disqualification from being heard, at least in Canada, based on, you know, our experience as a Christian think tank. So.
Okay, this is where I'm going to shift a little bit to what I referred to in the beginning as the second half, although we're going to have to keep it a little bit less than half, judging by time. But I wanted to talk a little bit about faith in institutions. Rachel, you at the beginning said that there is a role for faith in institutions, although maybe you could clarify that, just expand on that a little bit. But more generally, also, there's a lot of discussion these days about institutions, the trust that we have. This is where the trust comes in, the aspect of faith. The trust in institutions faltering a little bit, and the population's trust in them faltering and becoming more shaky. Do you have a take on that? And is there a role for faith in reinstituting some of that trust? I'll start with you, Rachel.
I mean, it's a really interesting question. I don't think anyone should ever put their ultimate trust in a human institution. I mean, that's bound to be extremely disappointing and upsetting in the end. You know, governments, politicians make really terrible gods. You know, that said, I think there is a role for, an important role for good governance, you know, governance to the extent that we can, that's modeled after a divine form, which is much superior, always will be superior, but we can at least try to meet that standard. But look, I know there's been a real decline and kind of fracturing of trust in human institutions. I think that's partly a result of just the kind of age we're in, and the kind of communications revolution that's taken place, that is still taking place now, where traditional sources of authority, and by traditional I mean like maybe the last 100 years, traditional sources of authority are no longer seen as being as authoritative as they were previously. But you know what? The same revolution, Paul Wells writes about this actually in a really interesting way. The Catholic Church was seen as the same kind of source of authority in previous ages, and that intermediary was removed, and it was incredibly disruptive and chaotic. But ultimately, it was ultimately, I think, a good thing. You know, I don't think our goal should be to ensure that institutions who have authority now or who had authority in the past should remain in authoritative positions forever. I think kind of the best we can do is play our role within those institutions in kind of a godly way, in a righteous way, and trust you know, the future of that institution or what is going to supplant it ultimately is going to be the right direction. So I don't think we should get too attached to traditions or institutions that are of this world. And I understand there's a temptation sometimes to do that because they feel safer and maybe better than the ones that look like they're coming to replace them. But I don't think we know that. I don't think we can see that. And so I think we have to be very careful about trying to hang on too tightly to what we have right now or have had in the past.
Interesting. Stephen, do you want to react to that?
Yeah, I think within institutions and our trust in institutions or faith in institutions is, it's an interesting question for me to reflect on personally. And I think Rachel is right from a societal perspective. From a personal perspective, I am somebody who has a high degree of trust in institutions. And I reflect on that, and I don't know what the answer to this question is. I don't know whether I work in the public service because I am of a nature that has a high degree of trust in institutions and therefore value that institution, or possibly because I'm an insider to that institution and therefore can see through some of the theater of it and understand and have confidence in what happens behind the scenes. I don't really know, but the fact of the matter is that when there's a societal conversation about the breakdown of trust in institutions, I don't feel that personally, and so that makes the question a little bit hard for me to reflect on. But I think it is important for me to reflect on it from the perspective of the public service as well. And when I think about that, I think about one word in particular, and I just to take a little bit of a tangent to introduce this word. There is a wonderful Christian man who I think is is known to Cardus in Stuttgart, who is a Christian, who was formerly the clerk of the Privy Council, so the top public servant in Canada, is now in the Senate. And he spoke recently in the Senate about the value of restraint. And I think that the word restraint and that notion of restraint is one that resonates well with me as I think about my role in public policy and my role within that institution supporting the government, because in effect, as a public servant, it doesn't matter within limits and within constraints, we can talk about that, but within sort of normal limits of Canadian society, it doesn't matter what I personally think or what I personally believe, what I prefer, who I vote for. What matters for me is that I respect the system and that I have chosen a career whose fundamental function is to uphold a system that supports a government that is duly elected by Canadian citizens. And so I am the institution, I am that system in a manner of speaking, and key to me doing my job well in the public service and thinking about that notion of flexibility and humility again. Fundamental to me doing my job well is nonpartisanship. It's me being able to work with a conservative government and demonstrate excellence and support them in the best possible way that I can, while maintaining the credibility to be able to do that again for a different government, and then do that again for a different government. Because holding on to that notion of restraint and putting myself secondary to the support of the government and support of the institution, that's what my job as a public servant is. It's that notion of restraint, of putting myself second. And why that's important is that this notion of trust that you're talking about, I think it's obvious, but it's worth stating that the trust is hard earned and it's delicate and it's quickly lost. And if I really hesitate to talk about examples of where the public service as an institution may have broken that trust, and so I won't talk about specific examples or individual examples, but as I was reflecting on something that I could share about, I was thinking about 2015, thinking about the transition of government from a conservative to a liberal government. And there are, within those parties, there are differing perspectives on the general nature of and probably trust in the institution of the public service. And what did we as public servants do? Some of us, when new prime minister came in, some of us had a very public exhibition of satisfaction, of comfort, of something with the new government coming in. I'm thinking of a specific incident in a specific department where the prime minister was in the lobby and the public servants crammed into the lobby, and we're probably doing everything but asking for autographs of the prime minister. Maybe there was some of that as well. But that feels good to some people at that moment. But that is going to be in people's minds when there's a change of government again. And when there is again a conservative government or a government of another stripe, people in the institution that supports the politicians are going to be thinking about the public service through that lens and thinking about trust of that institution, because for a moment, they broke that deal. They broke that notion of nonpartisanship. And I think that's I think it's really important to reflect on that from the perspective of trust in institutions. And maybe the very, very final thing that I would say, and see, Bob, you'll recognize some of this conversation because you and I have had it. When I think about government as an institution, what I try to use and what I genuinely believe myself is to use first-person language, not third-person language. So I reflect on government as being an institution of us, an institution for us, an institution that is effectively the way that our society has chosen to organize ourselves and to make decisions for ourselves. It's not an outside actor that is a force acting upon us. And that notion helps me to understand and respect and have trust in the institutions, the various institutions that form the government. Very, very final thing, and maybe just reflecting on, Rachel, your comments about the role of Christianity in that set of institutions. I agree with you. I think that similarly, if we were to explicitly inject Christianity into those institutions in a way that was legislating our expressions of faith or mandating social issues or whatever that derive from expressions of our faith, I think what we're doing is robbing the richness of our Christianity by forcing that on other people. And this is probably another panel and another conversation, but I think if we looked at the history of Christianity, what I would argue is that Christianity has been at its strongest over history when it has been in opposition, when it has been in moments of weakness, when it has not been controlling those powers, those governments, but when people have needed to choose it, when people have needed to want it for themselves.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to tie the current question with the next one because I want to give each of you an opportunity to talk a little bit about your field. We're running a little short on time, so we might have to keep it a little tight. But I'm going to start with Andrea because a lot of what you do at Cardus is work on institutions, which is why it's tying into the current question. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that, how your faith, your fundamental commitments kind of impact that area. And then we'll go to each of you and then wrap it up for Q&A.
Yeah, I think this picks up on some of the threads of previous things that we've said, but Renza mentioned that I started off in Cardus through the Next Gen Fellowship, and really what the Next Gen Fellowship is an introduction to the rich tradition that Christian thought has on social issues and policy issues, spanning 2,000 years. And so a lot of our work, especially when people think of institutions, they think of, the government or the market. But what Cardus tries to remind people is that there's a much broader definition there, that when we talk about institutions, we're also talking about the family, the union, the school, and many of these other places of worship, right? Many of these other institutions that each have their own purpose and a purpose that can't be filled by an institution larger than them or above them, be that the market or the state. And so all of our program areas touch on these various types of institutions, and I think we have to be mindful that the state has a tendency to arrogate to itself certain roles that are more appropriately carried out by these other sort of subsidiaries of society. But it's also important to remember that those institutions, the family, the school, the union, can't abdicate their responsibilities to fulfill their own purpose within our society that these other institutions cannot do. So the vast majority of our work is informed by that lens and kind of moves beyond some of those very specific social issues to show how the Christian tradition speaks to the right ordering of society and who we are as human beings fundamentally in a much broader and richer way than I think a lot of Christians have an appreciation for.
Rachel, you're at Meta, so you deal a lot with technology. Can you tell us a little bit about how faith might, or those fundamental commitments kind of influence that?
Yeah, I'll keep this very brief because I would love to get to Q&A. I think there's a lot to talk about. Look, people get alarmed about new technology. People are particularly alarmed now about artificial intelligence. Look, I'm not a tech person. I do public policy, so I'm not the engineer building this stuff. But I can say, look, God saw all of this coming long before the world was ever created, right? Saw artificial intelligence coming and the uses that would be made of that and all of the products that humans would create, long before time began. And so I think there is some comfort, at least for me, in knowing that none of these technologies are new and surprising to our creator. all of them, I don't think any of them are inherently good or inherently bad. All of them can be used for good. All of them can be used for bad. That's been the same way throughout human history. I think our role as people of faith is to maximize the good and minimize the bad to the extent that we're able to in our particular positions. That's certainly my perspective on kind of new technology that's developed at our company. And I spend a lot of my time doing that. And the good that comes of out of these new technologies in terms of connecting communities of faith, in terms of, if you're a Christian, there's no better way to kind of spread the gospel in an efficient fashion than through the internet. So I've seen a lot of good come from this. So I think it's important for us to just remember all the exhortations in Scripture, not to be afraid, not to be fearful of anything that we don't necessarily understand or recognize right away, but to understand that these are tools that we can use for good purposes.
Okay. A leap of faith, you might say.
Yes.
But, all right. Steve, climate change, how does that influence that?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just acknowledge that climate change is an interesting conversation for this discussion, because there's probably a wide range of views in many faith communities about climate change. Maybe not so much anymore whether or not climate change is real, but certainly a lot of different views on what our response to that ought to be. For the sake of time, I'm not going to talk about what Scripture has to say about carbon tax. I'll sidestep that, but just a it's interesting, just as an aside, as a public servant, I'm very careful about the language that I use, because even if I describe a concept as being carbon tax or carbon pollution pricing, I'm signaling something in how I use that language, which is a fascinating separate conversation for us to have as well. But the point that I think that is worthwhile, maybe if I pick one point to talk about in climate change, and just as a reminder, my responsibility right now is as Canada's chief negotiator for climate change, which means engaging internationally in the UN system, in the G7, in the G20, to talk with other countries about how our climate change commitments and how their climate change commitments are working, and what we can do to cooperate and collaborate towards attainment of commitments under a treaty, under the Paris Agreement. The point that I think is useful to make maybe in this context, and really bringing the conversation back to the original framing remark about our faith being sort of a reflection that all people around the globe are created in the image of God. My job gives me the opportunity to engage in questions of climate change with people from very different perspectives and very different lived realities in different parts of the world. And that ranges, for example, from, as a negotiator, part of my job is to try to encourage action from countries who are not as ambitious in their climate commitments as we think they ought to be. Countries like China or India, who are major emitters of carbon. And imagine how that conversation plays out in a discussion with India, which, as of April, is the world's most populous country, is a very, very poor country, a country that looks at us and says, you've had 100 years of an ability to use carbon, and you've built your economy on that. And now you're asking us in India, as we are trying to put together a development path for our people to bring them out of poverty, as you've done with yours. You're asking us to think about energy transition issues, energy poverty issues, economic development issues, and layer all of these things together. And some people in the Indian government would see opportunity there, that those two things can be married together and have synergy. And other people will look at those things and say, your climate policies are holding me back from being able to do what you did. And there's a real human question there about sort of the rights of people to the kind of economic reality that we live in Canada. Or another example of engaging with people in that way, I have conversations with people from the Maldives or with people from Antigua and Barbuda, small island developing states, who feel like climate change is not a future problem to solve, but a clear and present danger for themselves, an existential question where they worry about their tourism industry being flooded, or their livelihoods or their existence being flooded by rising sea levels or desertification or other issues like that. And Maldives is half the size of Ottawa from a population perspective. Antigua and Barbuda is a tenth of the size of Ottawa from a population perspective. Their negotiators, when I'm engaging with them in the UN context, their accountabilities to their people are so much more direct than ours. They're hopping off out of the airports after these meetings, and their family and their neighbors are asking them what we had done for them. And I think that the key message then, and what the opportunity I have as chief negotiator, yes, I have a job to do. And that job is sometimes adversarial, and it's sometimes difficult. And my job is certainly not to give everybody everything that they dream about. But what I can do, and what my faith speaks into that, is just to recognize the experience that people have, recognize that their perspectives are legitimate, recognize the dignity of the people who they are, and recognize that for the differences that they have with us and the challenges that they face, they are our brothers and sisters in Christ around the world. And that's a perspective that I bring to that job as climate change negotiator.
Thank you very much, and thank you, all of you, for these fascinating comments. I realize we've covered a lot of ground, and so, but I hope that means that there's lots of opportunities for questions. Monica's going to go around with a microphone, so please lift your hand if you have a question. I'll call on you, and Monica will bring you a microphone. I see the first one, and then if you could direct, if it's a question specific to a person, please do direct it to that person. If it's to the panel, that's fine. You can indicate that too.
This one's for the panel, I think. Steve, I heard you say that you didn't allow your Anabaptist background to infuse your policy advice on the Crimean situation in 2014. And I heard Rachel say that you don't want to impose something on an unwilling population. And I understand both of those points, but I was wondering, as I look at policy making in the public service, in politicians, in business, in academia, the policies that come out seem to be definitely infused by the worldview of the policymakers. Do you feel that Christians put themselves at a disadvantage of providing good policy advice if we are more self-aware about our worldview than perhaps others are?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that. I think that's a really good question. I think your worldview should absolutely inform the sort of policy options you're presenting to decision makers, for sure. They can and should. I don't think, at least from my perspective, and Steve will have a different perspective in the public service, politicians almost never lead public sentiment, they follow it. And so decisions that come out from Parliament or even from the Supreme Court really are responding to what they're seeing and feeling in the broader population. They're hardly ever leading the way on that. So this is why I think it's so important on particular policy issues that people of faith care about, whether it's abortion, whether it's medical assistance in dying, whether it's palliative care. The real task, and the much more difficult task, is to change the views, change the minds of Canadians, because that's ultimately how you're going to get lasting policy change at the political level. It's much harder. It's easy to say, let's just elect a bunch of people who feel a certain way about an issue and hope that they're going to impose a law that's just going to apply nationally. Like that, it won't stick. You know, if it sticks for a few months, you might be lucky. It'll be overturned by the courts or overturned by the next government in very short order. That's why I think, at least at the political level, I don't think you'll ever see a politician kind of saying like this is the right way to go, and if only you give them the right advice, they're going to lead the way on it. They never do. They're always responding to what the broader population is pushing for. So I think that's where the focus is. That's not to say that your advice shouldn't be informed by your worldview, and that you shouldn't say, look, I think this option is significantly better than this other option, say on medical assistance in dying. You know, I don't think this is good direction for us to go, and here's why. I think it's a slippery slope. I think it's going to end up, you know, kind of where we see it ending up now. And I think all of that can inform your policy advice. I just don't think ultimately, if you're looking for lasting change, that's the best channel.
Maybe I was reflecting on what I said before and how that feeds into your question. I don't want to leave the impression that a good public servant is like a mercenary, that, you know, that doesn't matter what we're working on, we'll just, you know, we'll do anything for anybody. I think that taken to its extreme, that's a dangerous thought. Instead, while we've had this conversation about how faith can explicitly engage the questions that we work on, what is true is that faith affects who I am. It shapes my worldview. It shapes how I look at policy questions. It shapes how I interact with ministers and their staff. It shapes how, it does shape. My worldview shapes the advice that I put forward. And I'm chosen for these jobs within the public service because of who I am, because of the value that I bring to these questions. And inherently in that, if what shapes me and my worldview is my faith, and people for various reasons are selecting me to do jobs on the basis of the value that I bring to that, faith is woven into that tapestry, and faith is inherently a part of the way that I do my job in all sorts of ways. Not necessarily explicit, not necessarily easily something that can be pointed at, but is there and is verifiable. And the final thing that I would say is with respect to the notion of peace theology, because that was the specific example that I brought. And I think it's an interesting one for this room, because it's the kind of a faith question that I know there's a very broad diversity of across faith communities. So if we had a different panel and spoke about peace theology, we would probably have all sorts of different people with different perspectives on what a Christian's role is in engaging through government, in armed conflict, in various wars for various reasons. I have the humility to think that I don't necessarily have the right answer on that question, and all of us working together through theological issues can help one another to understand a diversity of perspectives. And I think that's the key element of my role as a public servant, is to understand perspectives of various governments, why they were in office, what motivates them, what drives them, and how I can best support them to deliver on their agenda.
I want to talk a little bit about, you've heard sort of intersection, and that isn't always necessarily clean, and how public policy might necessarily happen in a vacuum. When it comes to disagreement, how would you say that your own faith has formed you in the ability to navigate disagreements, perhaps conflicting worldviews in your roles, in terms of service, in terms of advocacy, in terms of discernment?
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in first and keep it quick. That's a really interesting question, because I was thinking about this when Steve was talking about the carbon tax. I actually think you can be a Christian or a person of faith, and you can be a partisan as well. And you can advocate for particular outcomes that you think are better than other outcomes. But I think ultimately the real test, I suppose, of your faith is in how you do that. and how you do that work. And I'm not even convinced, although I shouldn't tell my party that, I'm not even convinced that one outcome is in the end really better than another outcome when it comes to something like the carbon tax. But I think the way you conduct yourself in kind of dealing with your opponents on an issue like that, if you're slinging insults online or on TV, or if you're demonizing your opponents or misrepresenting the facts, all of these things, we know they're wrong. You know, those aren't the ways to make your arguments. And if you can make it respectfully, if you can remain grounded in facts, I remain like adamantly opposed to the carbon tax because I think it imposes a real burden on working people when there is no alternative for them to switch to. So, you know, for instance, if there was a renewable alternative to fill up their cars or to heat their homes, so yeah, carbon tax makes a lot of sense. There isn't. And so I think it's just an added burden on people at a time when, you know, expenses are already incredibly significant, getting worse by the day. So I can advocate for that, but I can do it in a way that is not grounded in mistruth or full of misinformation or insulting to my opponents. So I think there is a real role. I mean, not in Steve's job. He should be nonpartisan in his position. I think there is a real role for partisanship because that's the way in our system that we advocate for different outcomes. I think the way we do it is really the important part.
And just very quickly, my role as a public servant makes my answer to disagreements quite different. And I mean, we can think about disagreements in a lot of different contexts, but if we just think about sort of the political arena and who gets to make decisions on public policy matters, it's clear in the public service that our job and the deputy minister's job is to provide advice to a minister, to a prime minister. They get to decide, they're elected, people chose them to be the decision makers, and we implement. And what that does, I think for a good public servant anyways, it creates a culture that allows us to be comfortable with that kind of ambiguity, comfortable with that notion that it is not us who gets to decide. And if I did want to decide, I could change my career path. But the other element of it also is that it is, and this trust, this notion of trust in institutions. When I'm engaging with political staff, I know that the trust that they have in me is very fragile. And if I ever breach that trust, it probably cannot be rebuilt within that same group of people, within that same government. And that's very damaging. And so when I think about disagreements with political staff, and of course we have conversations with political staff all the time about their agenda and how to support a minister, I need to be very, very careful with that. I need to be delicate. I need to express what we call my fearless advice. I need to be honest about that because that is good government. But I need to do that in a way that is grounded in an understanding of what their interests are, what their needs are, what their perspectives are. And my advice to a government can be most persuasive when I best understand where they're coming from and can anchor my advice in their perspectives and their worldview. So that notion of disagreement, I think, is requires a very careful and sensitive balance.
Yeah, I'd say, I think I have maybe 3 things, but that's because I had lots of time to think about it. I think the first is that our faith really helps in figuring out how to order the kinds of issues that we're talking about, right? So I think there's a tendency sometimes, if you were once a young overzealous Christian, to not naming any names, but to treat all issues like they're life or death issues, for example. And so, you know, like our faith tradition has very clear things to say about the life or death issues, and I think there is an appropriate level of seriousness for those very objective, immovable things. But, you know, I don't believe that the carbon tax, for example, or climate change policy, or a whole bunch of other very nuanced policies down the line rise to that same level of intensity about a life or death issue. And I think that's where Christians sometimes don't get a hearing, because then they treat every position or every issue like it's one of a very clear yes or no. And I would say the second thing is the viewing every person in the image and likeness of God includes the person that I disagree with, right? So if I'm trying to transmit that perspective in a policy while also disregarding the fact that you are also created in the image and likeness of God, I've kind of missed the point. And I think maybe sort of the third thing, and I think this is our like very Canadian tendency, is to view disagreement as a sign that something is going wrong. And I think oftentimes, especially institutionally and like in terms of the health of institutions, disagreement, I think, is often a sign that something is going right. It means that you care deeply about the issue that you're dealing with, you care deeply, you believe deeply the position that you've formulated, and you're willing to engage with someone else. And so, you know, working at Cardus, you can imagine that we frequently engage with people we disagree with. But our disposition, or at least the disposition that I try to cultivate and that we all do, is not just to talk about them or to talk at them, but to talk to the people that we disagree with. Understanding that we have things to learn from them too, and that we're all just engaging in this exercise for, you know, the kind of country that we want to build. So that was a little bit, I don't know, feel good, but.
Monica, do we have time for one last question? Okay, okay, go ahead.
Thank you. A great discussion. I can certainly attest that when I worked at PCO and I dealt with Rachel, she made no attempt to impose her Christian views upon me. They don't start our meetings with a prayer, although maybe that would have helped. You know, I think, you know, for Christians who are trying to impose your faith on others, it's always an oxymoron. I think faith is something that has to come from within, and I think history teaches that. But I think, you know, there are those who don't believe that. And as Christianity has receded in our society, other points of view, other ways of thinking about the world have come to take that place. And for a while, I think that was a sort of a, you know, this sort of a secular humanist kind of religion, if you like, which I think was very, had a stance very much of indifference to Christianity, but shared in many ways some of, I think, the values that the Christians have. But I see in society an evolution of that. And I think there is, you know, there is a worldview now that is commanding increasing support, which is not tolerant of different points of view, is not tolerant of different values. And it's not just, you know, Christians shut up, but it's, or other people shut up, it's people have to actively profess their faith in this kind of new religion. And I'm just wondering whether for Christians, you know, harder times are not coming because of that. Although I do also think that there is a potential opportunity here for Christians as well, as I think some of that middle ground is just getting harder to sustain as people are looking for values. It's pushing them, yes, in one kind of ideological direction, but as people search for meaning in their life, I think there's an opportunity for Christians here as well. So I just wondered whether I'm a little too pessimistic, because I'm older than all of you, or whether there's some validity to that.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Tim. Like for many, many years, for most of the history of this country, the framework, the worldview was explicitly Christian, and that was just the assumption. And very recently, that is no longer the case. And so that does make it, I think in many senses, more difficult for Christians, absolutely. But I do think people of faith should welcome that. I mean, as Steve said, you know, faith is tested most, and I think strengthened most in difficult times, when you've got to stand up and defend it and you have no idea how to do that and no one else really understands what you're talking about or shares your worldview. I think that is an exercise in strengthening faith in a way that's ultimately really valuable. So I don't think we should be pessimistic about that. And maybe I'm just overly optimistic. But I think we should welcome the challenge and step up to it. And you know, discussions like this, I think, are maybe the beginning of that.
I also don't fear that future. You know, I think I recognize, like you, that future may be upon us. But the only way that I would fear that future is if I were judging success, whether that's my own career success or the success of Canadian society or something like that, through the lens of the world, like through, you know, are we most successful as Christians when Canada's GDP is as high as it can be? Are we most successful as Christians when there are as many people walking through our church doors as possible? I mean, we could debate some of those things, but I'm not sure that that's how, as people of faith, we should measure success in the world, and therefore, I'm not sure that that's how we should measure what we fear or what we don't. And I think, as Rachel said, and as we sort of spoke about through this conversation, I think embracing Christianity as an underdog has its value in the world. And I think that there's some merit to that as well, as challenging as that would be.
Yeah, I think the last time I was on a panel like this, I accidentally made an ageist joke, and so I'm going to try not to do that this time. But I think sometimes we kind of harken back to the good old days, and what I'll say is that I don't recall those days. I think that for a lot of people in my generation, it has always been the case that being a Christian is or having some of these views is not the most popular thing. And so for me, this is just how it is, and that's where I reach my political maturity or in a context like that. And so yeah, I would echo Rachel's points that I think that we should rise to the occasion, and I keep going back to this human dignity created in the image and likeness of God thing for good reason. But I think when we look at the world sort of out there, we have a tendency to think that we are engaging people who are fundamentally different from us, but in actuality, they are fundamentally the same. And so despite our disagreements, and I'm not trying to be naive about it, but I think that if you allow yourself, if as Christians we allow ourselves to slip into that despair, then we've also missed the point of what we claim to believe, right? So I think just going out there with this sense that you are engaging with people who are fundamentally the same as you and are looking for the same things despite it manifesting in different ways, will probably keep your hair black for longer and keep you happier and keep you engaged in the work that you're doing.
I'm told we have time for one more question if there is someone who would like to. Looks like you have one.
This is fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for coming. And my question is painting a little bit more in broad strokes and looking more at the church in general. I think if you're coming out on a Wednesday night like this, you're very interested in politics, and I imagine everyone here is. But I think, judging from the sentiment of my peers and the Christians just at church that I'm seeing around is kind of looking at politics. I think the church is becoming more of maybe a weapon to be used in the political sphere. And I'm wondering, for all of you guys that are immersed in this world, what is kind of your message to the average layperson? As the person that, is maybe caught up on those hot topic issues or is looking at those things as kind of the do or die of Christianity today. What is your message to them? And what do you think the job is of those lay people who are just kind of living as really the Christian witnesses in the world today? What's your call to them as people to be political inside, and what's the role of the church in that political sphere?
You should apply to the Next Gen program. I think young people should be very wary not to use their politics as their lens for their religion, to look at their religion through their political lens and to rather do the opposite, to use what we believe as the lens through which we view everything else. I can understand, especially for the people who reached their political maturity, let's say in the past sort of 3 to 5 years, that there were many frustrations and complex public policy issues that I think galvanized a certain sentiment amongst young people. But I would say that's my biggest caution, and to remember that politics will not save you. You already know who saved you. So I think I would just be very, very careful not to slip into that. It's not to say not to be engaged. All the people up here and in this room are here because we care about these issues and we are engaged. But yeah, I would just be very hesitant to use your politics as a lens for everything.
Yeah, I think that Andrea just said it perfectly. I actually don't think God is necessarily attached to particular policy outcomes. I'm super passionate about public policy and about this country, and probably inappropriately so. But I think we have to keep our eye on the eternal. And, as the writer of Ecclesiastes said, vanity, vanity. all is vanity. And I think that's ultimately what it is. And what it really comes down to, and what's really important in the end, is kind of your individual spiritual journey and development and your relationship with God. And so as important as it is, and we're not meant to extract ourselves from the world and not be involved in it. And as important as these issues are, they're not, I think we have to remember, they're not ultimately of kind of eternal or divine importance. And we just have to remember to kind of keep our eyes on the eternal and never lose sight of that. So I agree with what Andrea said, 100%.
All right, that's the last word. I would just like to thank our panelists for an excellent and engaging conversation. Let's give them a round of applause.